So, well, let me see what's next on my. All right, we're gonna try this here real quick. I keep referencing this show, and I spent way too much time today tracking down this clip, and I hope I can show it to you. But this clip kind of describes the true complexity of doing no harm. Doing no harm seems like such a simple thing, but if I can get this with the audio, because half the time I miss the audio. Oh, share sound button. All right. Okay, let's see if we can do this.
Michael, how did it go? Is the committee going to help us?
The committee's a bunch of ineffectual dorks in fleece vests. The Titanic is sinking, and they're writing a strongly worded letter to the iceberg. How much more evidence do they need? The bad place has to be tampering with the system. There's no other explanation.
Can I ask you an unrelated question?
Absolutely not. The fate of all of humanity is at stake, and time is running out.
Just real quick, can everybody hear that okay? Oh, I lost everybody.
Yeah, I can hear it.
Okay. In this like science fiction universe, there's a good place and there's a bad place. And there's this point tally, like every good thing you do, you get points for. Every bad thing you do, you lose points. And if you get a high enough score at the end of your life, you go to the good place. And now they're kind of talking about how it's been rigged and nobody's been getting into the good place. They're going to kind of talk about why now.
Go ahead.
I'm trying to help Jason and Janet navigate some very complex feelings, but everything I do makes it worse. You know them better than anyone else. How do I just make them happy?
How do you make Jason happy? You give him a lollipop shaped like a transformer.
You'd think it'd be that simple, but every time I do something nice, it backfires. There are so many unintended consequences to well-intentioned actions. It feels like a game you can't win.
That's it. There is another explanation. Unintended consequences. Oh, Tahani, you did it.
Well, of course I did, darling. Did what?
All along, I've only been looking at one Doug, but there's millions of Dougs in here. In 1534, Douglas Winegar of Hawkhurst, England, gave his grandmother roses for her birthday. He picked them himself, walked them over to her. She was happy. Boom, 145 points. Now, yeah, here we go. In 2009, Doug Ewing of Skaggsville, Maryland, also gave his grandmother a dozen roses, but he lost 4 points. Why? Because he ordered roses using a cell phone that was made in a sweatshop. The flowers were grown with toxic pesticides, picked by exploited migrant workers, delivered from thousands of miles away, which created a massive carbon footprint, and his money went to a billionaire racist CEO who sends his female employees pictures of his genitals. Woo!
That is a very odd thing to cheer.
Don't you understand? The bad place isn't tampering with points. They don't have to. Because every day the world gets a little more complicated, and being a good person gets a little harder.
So that kind of like displays the complexity of how interconnected our worlds are. Like that one poor Doug who ended up causing more harm in the world because he ordered his grandmother roses, and all of those unintended consequences happen. So that's kind of the depth of the do no harm that Wesley was kind of talking about. And we're going to talk a little bit. Oh, that's probably still not. Let me share that again here. Because there is the simple like interpersonal do no harm that Bishop Job talked about the most. I also got the companion discussion guide on this, and the author of the discussion guide went a totally different like social level. And we'll talk a little bit about both here. So, as we get started here, why do I keep losing you guys? There you guys are. For some reason, your smiling faces were like disappeared on my screen, so I had to take a second to find them. I probably should have done this last time, but I want to do a quick overview of John Wesley to kind of put a lot of what he's believing in context here, because Bishop Job references him a lot because these are his simple rules. He was born in 1703 to a Samuel Wesley and Susan Wesley, and he was one of 15 children, 11 of which survived until adulthood. He was about right in the middle. Charles Wesley was significantly, I think, 8 years younger than him. Charles Wesley was kind of his cohort. His father was a very much hated priest. They hated the guy. When John was about 5 years old, they hated him so much that they burned down the parsonage with his family in it. So I always think to myself, whenever I feel like my congregations don't love me as much as I would like to be loved, at least they won't burn down the parsonage with my children inside. You'll wait until they're out. But that kind of had like a really huge impact on him. They were not very well off. They were quite poor. I mean, when you have 15 kids, it doesn't matter how much money you make, you're probably going to be poor. Susan Wesley was very dedicated to getting them educated. So all the kids were absolutely brilliant. He was ordained a priest in 1725 at the age of 22. He got a fellowship at Oxford. And that fellowship paid for his high-end education. But as most top-tier schools, most people who go to the top-tier schools are well off. Especially at that time, they would have been in the aristocracy. They would have been landed nobility of England, and he would have been like the token poor person there. So that would have helped him like identify the huge difference between the rich in his society and where he came from in society. He got to see that front and center when he was a fellow at Oxford. He started the first holiness club, and this is what we call the Wesleyan accountability groups. This is the method. His younger brother Charles and their friends, they would gather in groups of 5 to 8 every week and read scripture and pray together. And they would start sharing goals. Like, this week I'm going to visit the prison. This week I'm going to visit the hospital. This week I'm going to visit all of these people who are sick. This week I'm going to do this many hours of fasting and such like that. And every week they would come through and they would say, I met my goals or I didn't meet my goals. But they would hold each other accountable to that growth. And that in its core is the method of Methodism. But again, this is during the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Wesley kind of saw an agrarian society start moving to the city, and how the poverty of an influx of cheap labor, how that created such huge and harsh conditions in his place. So he always spoke out against that labor exploitation is doing harm in the society that he grew up in. He got his first appointment to the Savannah Colony by James Oglethorpe. Did not go well at all. Wesley's always been very anti-gambling, anti-drinking, anti-guns, firearms shooting. And Georgia is Georgia. They kind of like those things. He really felt that it was his calling to do ministry with the first Americans or Native Americans. But when he got there, he saw, like, up close and personal, the atrocities of slavery. And so it was always racial justice was something that he always felt very passionately about. But while he was in Savannah, he fell in love with a lady by the name of Sophie Hopkey. And he was unsure of whether or not he should ever actually truly marry, because the Bible says that those of the priestly order should not, and he kind of waffled, and then she found somebody else. He got jealous and refused her and her husband communion, and then he was brought up on charges, and since he knew that he would actually be stripped of his ordination, he ran away and came back to England, went into a deep depression. And after this deep depression, he was at a church on Aldersgate listening to the Moravians, which is like a German Lutheran group, reading from Luther's commentary on Romans, and he had this big spiritual epiphany. And that's where he really got his renewed faith to kind of go and use his holiness clubs to create disciples. I missed that last slide. But which is really kind of important to just kind of recognize that Methodism at its core, what makes us different than most other denominations, is our core focus on transforming disciples and transforming the world. We are about growth and accountability to that growth. Nobody is ever good enough. No church is good enough. No congregation is good enough. So we're always looking to find new ways to grow and do better. That's the whole core of who we are as a church. Now, whether or not the local churches still reflect that or not, but that's our theological and spiritual foundation. How do we do better? And that's kind of John Wesley's life story of how he kind of got to his 3 simple rules. Here, this is actually a plaque that is up at the John Wesley Museum at his Church on the River, which is where like his only official appointment through the Church of England. And here you can actually see his manifesto of all these like 12 things that the government and society should advocate for. Somebody want to read those for us? Hey, Bonita, can you squint and read that fancy font there?
Sure. 1, reduce the gap between rich people and poor people. 2, help everyone to have a job. 3, help the poorest, including introducing a living wage. Offer the best possible education. Help everyone to feel they can make a difference. Promote tolerance. Promote equal treatment for women. Create a society based on values and not on profits and consumerism. End all forms of slavery. Avoid getting into wars. Share the love of God with everyone. Care for the environment.
When John Wesley sat down to write this manifesto, this was in the 1780s.
That's pretty modern, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
We're still working on it.
it always will be until.
Oh yeah, probably like on every single point. And sadly these sound political, and I reject that because he had these beliefs before we were ever a country. But at the same time, all of the major political parties believe this. They think that these are the goals. The way we get to those goals, the policy is different. I don't think you're going to find any Democrat or Republican that says, no, we don't want equal treatment for women. They may disagree on how they get there. They may disagree on the extent of that problem. But all of us believe in those things.
Have you ever met Steve King?
Yeah. I have not met him, no.
I've actually talked to him. He's, yeah.
Not all Methodists are great either. It's okay. Oh no, he's Catholic. He grew up Reformed, but he's Catholic now. That's right.
Yeah, we don't.
Yeah, and again, this is all of these go back to doing no harm. Wesley truly believed that we are harming people by not giving them an education. We are harming them by paying them less than a living wage. In one of his journals, he actually has this like big old soapbox rant saying either the job isn't worth doing or the person's not worth living. God says that one isn't true. Society has accepted the other, and that can't be right. So Wesley was a pretty radical, out there kind of guy. There are reasons why he got chased out of most of the towns that he decided to show up and preach in. But again, all these go back to doing no harm and doing good. Next time we'll talk a little bit more on the United Methodist social principles, but all of those kind of come back to Wesley's understanding of Scripture and how these 12 points kind of can be lived out in our daily life. Which, if you had a list like the top 12 biggest concerns for our church, would your 12 look like this, or would it look very different than this?
action for
No, I,
children.
yeah, Monita said there's nothing in here about children and care, you know,
Other than education.
education, but I'd say this is right on. I think it,
I like it.
I do too.
and it's obviously stood the test of time.
Yeah. I don't know if it stood the test of time or we just haven't got around to finishing those yet.
I was gonna say, we've stood the test of time of being sinners.
And it's kind of funny. Like one of these days I'll just do a whole thing on John Wesley because he's such a fascinating, deeply brilliant, deeply flawed person. He probably didn't focus on children much because he didn't like them. He didn't have any of his own, but he had, I think, 4 or 5 stepchildren that he did not get along with at all. Very unhappy home life. Sophie Hopke was just the first of one of his many women woes. But yeah, I would definitely say that I would also advocate more. I'm married to a healthcare attorney who focuses on senior care law, aging gracefully, rights of the aging, rights of those in nursing home, rights of like advocating for those in that level of need. I think that would probably make my list of 12.
Yeah, people in his day probably didn't live as to old age like we do.
Yeah.
Like we do now.
Well, like part of that too is the fact that I think I've shared this before. The first generation to retire and live 20 years is still alive. In all of human history, we're the first ones that we get to stop our professional lives at some point. Whereas in Wesley's day, if you were a miller, you'd be a miller until you lost a hand when you're in your 60s. It was kind of a rough life. What do you think, Donna? A lot of people, and this might just be the group that we are, but I think a lot of people would say, I don't know if this is the church's responsibility.
I can't argue with anything on there. I could argue with the way he phrased some of the things.
Oh, yeah.
Like promoting tolerance isn't really, that's not the same as acceptance or inclusion.
Yeah.
I tolerate a lot of things, but that doesn't mean I, accept them. I didn't grow up a Methodist.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always found it interesting that the Methodist Church really focuses a lot on what I would have considered social issues.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't where we put our attention in the church I grew up in. So I didn't really answer your question.
No, I think you did. I mean, really, because it's these are different than what you grew up with. Is what I'm hearing.
Yes.
Hey, Maggie, how are you?
I'm doing great.
We were just talking about Wesley, a little bit about Wesley's life and his kind of manifesto, and how we're kind of looking at that going, would this be a manifesto? Like, would we talk about these in a modern church? Are these really like church issues or church values? And yeah, I mean, it's surprising because he doesn't mention food. Have you noticed that?
What?
He doesn't talk about food or feeding people.
Oh.
And what
He
is
wants
the
to care for
old
the
ministry
environment.
we never get people to agree on in the church? Feeding people.
Number 11 is the one that resonates with me. I mean, that was my roots. That's where I came from.
Yeah.
The rest of it, yeah. But number 11.
Well, living wage would be food.
Yeah.
So,
And care of the environment,
yeah.
sustainability. I agree with Donna. These do have a social agenda ring to it, as opposed to, it's not what I would have been used to growing up as religious topics, although, there a lot of these things did. Tolerance was not one of the ones that I was raised. Yeah.
But they should be religious.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Wesley, in his very methodical expression, he sharing love is very vague. So it's like, how do we show love for the world? How do we show love for creation? Like that should have been like number one upon which all of them were built. And he kind of says that in some of his journal writings. Another thought there, but it's gone now.
I think there's some other things that promotes self-worth here. Help everyone to feel they can make a difference, give them an education, give them a job, you know, living. There's a lot of things to promote self-worth here. That was it, and that also, it doesn't have much to do with your relationship with God as much as your relationship with yourself.
Yeah. Wesley, in some of his journals, he talks a lot about how the commandment to love others as you love yourself would also require you to love yourself.
Right.
And a lot of people don't have that strong a sense of self-worth. So it was his thing to passionately give people that sense of self-worth. Like, you are a beloved child of God. As a beloved child of God, you need to see yourself the way God sees you. And once you see yourself the way God sees you, you can see others that way too. And that's kind of where that kind of the connection to God and self-worth is kind of in his mindset. And do you guys remember the mission statement of the United Methodist Church? Who can say it off the top of their head?
Something about making global disciples or something.
Make disciples of Christ.
Of Jesus Christ for the transformation
of the world.
There we go. That's the same thing I said.
Yep, I'm pretty close. They cheat because they have to say it every Sunday. And this is the second part. This is the transformation of the world. If we are making disciples and we are making empowered disciples, if we're equipping our disciples, the disciples will go forth and do these things, was his mindset. And all of this skips over the discipleship part, though, doesn't it? It's just like, once we have our discipleship down, then we go do these things. The discipleship is kind of a couple steps back. But again, I just want to show you guys, all of these things in Wesley's mind was, if we don't do these, we're causing harm. He viewed that the highest form of oppression was poverty. The UK banned slavery like hundreds of years before we ever did, but the indentured servitude, the debt labor, all of that stuff, forcing people to live in poverty was as much oppression as slavery was in his mind. So this is all the things that we can see by doing harm, whether intentionally or unintentionally. So, how do we live by the first general rule? All of our actions have the potential to cause harm. Who do we intend to harm the most?
Probably ourselves.
What makes you say that, Marge? Or can you give an example?
We don't think we're good enough.
Yeah.
So why try?
That's part of it, yeah. There's also the Wesleyan holistic approach. I caused myself harm because after Little Ninjas, Lily and I went out and we had ice cream, and I didn't need the ice cream. I make a whole bunch of bad health decisions.
Kind of the first thing that popped into my mind, we maybe tend to harm the people that we're the closest to sometimes the most, because that's who we interact with, that's who we see, and that's sometimes the people that we don't think before we speak with, you know, because they're our friends, or they're our family, or they're our neighbors, or co-workers, and that's what popped into my mind first.
Oh yeah.
Me too. It was family members that I thought of first.
Yeah, that you stole that from me. That was the first thing that popped into my head. The second thing was the people that we don't understand or that we're afraid of. Because that's easy and it's justifiable, right?
Yeah, especially I have a very diverse group of friends in my personal life, and people of all races, religions, genders, backgrounds, all that kind of stuff. And my son just got over like hand, foot, and mouth disease. I will forever have foot and mouth disease, and I just unintentionally I try to make a joke, and it just comes out. Ugh. So I'm very glad that a lot of my friends and my acquaintances are very gracious with my bad sense of humor. You never know how words will land sometimes.
I think Bishop Job in the book here, though, he kind of addresses this, and he mentioned that in order to do no harm, it takes a radical amount of trust in God's presence, power, wisdom, and guidance, and radical obedience to his leadership.
Yeah, that's on the next slide of this one after that. That's pretty big statement there, isn't it?
I think, yeah, it's so if you're the one that's saying I'm going to do no harm, but it takes a lot of trust that things are going to work out okay. If you're on one side of conflict resolution, you don't think the other side buys it.
Yeah, I had that whole quote right there. Like the thing that jumped out at me the most, and my mind goes back to our 3 simple rules for re-entry, which are modeled off of these three simple rules. But the self-discipline and very deep faith that God will empower the faithful, and how gotta move my screen here. Guidance, radical obedience to God's leadership. That phrase, a radical obedience to God's leadership. Does anybody have that anymore?
I've
How
got a
would we
black
define, like,
mark across that.
leadership, and how would we define radical obedience?
It sure was tested this past year, that's for sure.
I listened to a preaching podcast. I listened to several preaching podcasts. One of them was talking about the Hebrew Bible story for this Sunday, which no one will read. No preacher will ever preach on this passage ever. It casually gets mentioned in the John 3:16 passages, but Moses is guiding people through the desert. Through the wilderness. He's guiding them through the wilderness, and they're complaining again. And the Bible actually says, and the people complained that there was no bread, and that they hated the bread that they had. Like, make up your mind, guys, no bread or you hate the bread. So God gets tired of them, and he sends poisonous snakes to bite them and kill them. And then God, like Moses goes and prays on their behalf, and God says, fine, lift up put a snake statue on a stick. So if somebody gets bitten, they can look at the statue and then be healed. And only reason why it's in there is because it's referenced in the conversation with Nicodemus. But in this podcast, one pastor just goes like, you know what, after this past year of trying to convince people to follow safety protocols, I see where God's coming from. I see, like, you want to die? Fine, die. See if I can. I'm like, I wouldn't go that far. But we definitely fell short of that radical obedience, didn't we?
It comes, for me, it's that control issue. We all I shouldn't say we all, many of us like to think that we're in control. We want to be in control. And radical obedience or trust in God's presence means we have to give up that thought.
Yeah.
We don't do that well.
Amen.
Of course, with the exception of Maggie and I, most of you probably haven't had your own toddlers for a while, but when you are parenting toddlers, you know that you have no control. None. It's all out of our hands. Right, Maggie?
Yeah.
More age groups to go through.
Exactly. I find a lot of people, myself included, it's easy to have faith in God. It's easy to have faith in Jesus. But when that faith calls us to have faith in our neighbor and our brother, in our the people who walk along with us in the journey, that's when we start to question the most, isn't it?
Yeah, we all think God's our own, and guess what? God loves our neighbor just as much as he loves us. Or there's no gender to God either. So,
Oh yeah.
so, but yeah, just as much. And it doesn't sound right either. I don't know what the right. But yeah, we all think that that it's our God. It's everyone's God. So.
And I think part of this is recognizing that when we force our God to be the God, or someone else's God, we're causing harm, or at least that belief, that stubbornness will walk us down the path towards harm. He has a passage, I don't think I had it written down, but where he talks about, like, are we willing to give up the power of our political nature, our power of our social stature? Are we willing to give up our power of insisting that we are right?
I think that was one of the things that resonated with me, Nate, is that one of the hardest things to do no harm is to abandon the idea that you're always right.
Amen. Amen.
I have a phrase I use often with my staff, and they never can answer this the way I want them to, but I will ask them, do you want to be right, or do you want to be happy? And by golly, they always want to be right. But do you want to be right, or do you want to be happy?
Jan and Pat can probably attest to this since they sit on parish council. I will openly admit I have no idea what I'm doing. That's why we fall back on the Book of Discipline. That's why we fall back on the bishop. That's why we have a connectional church, that somebody bigger than me is doing things that I don't see. And I have faith that God is leading them, that God is empowering them. And it's hard when those wheels are in motion behind, curtains we don't get to look behind. Yeah, I would imagine oncology would probably have to require that kind of faith, if that were ever your profession. Just knowing that all of these things are going in there and hoping that they're doing the thing that they're supposed to be doing.
I mean, being a patient of an oncologist, or being an oncologist?
Being an oncologist, I mean, well, being a patient as well.
Well, in all of medicine, one of the most commonly reiterated dictum is first, do no harm. It's beaten into us. It really is. And so all disciplines, I think, and it brings up some dilemmas. Oncology would be a good one, because, you sometimes, in order to kill the cancer, you hope you don't kill the patient, literally. And at the time that adage came up, a lot of therapies weren't very good. Not that we're a lot better today, but we're a little better.
More targeted.
Everything's incremental. That whole concept of radical obedience, I just think that that's something that's been beaten out of our culture, isn't it? For good or for bad. Because I mean, like, a little bit of testing, a little bit of questioning, a little bit of pushback is never a bad thing. That's why I was so appreciative that Bishop Job ends this passage with, "in a very, very large measure of grace," because That'll always cut, like, make all the loose ends get tied up, right?
Mhm.
So my wife has asked me what our Wi-Fi password is. I have no idea. It's been in my phone forever. So this last bit, it's like the last half page there, or at least was on my Kindle. What would it mean if we took the first simple rule seriously? Examination of how we live and practice our faith. I love his comment about how this, do no harm, is a proactive response to evil. Is that how you read do no harm, as a proactive response?
No,
Yeah,
I thought it was going to be the easy part until I read the chapter.
yeah. So much of this goes for me. It goes back to that whole story of the fall. How one bad decision had such rippling consequences. That one bad decision, and I believe that is metaphorical, but I believe that that's how reality works. Is that one bad decision will cause something else to happen, cause something else to happen, cause something else to happen. We made a mistake. All of a sudden, all of nature is now in conflict. We keep damaging nature. Nature comes back and damages us, and this whole cycle kind of goes through. And I like how doing no harm makes us realize that our actions cause so much chaos. So it's not just a don't do that bad thing. How do we stop bad things from happening?
Well, I think the idea that it's proactive, though, is, if everybody really set out to do this first,
yep,
a lot of people wouldn't get hurt. A lot of bad things wouldn't happen. This is a preventative, proactive strategy to evil, if there ever was one. Let's not hurt each other. Let's start with that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. We are trained in our loose clergy training that we have. We get a lot of, here's the Bible, here's more Bible, here's our history. Oh, here's how to be a pastor. Well, that's a footnote. But in that, they talk about how in your leadership committees establish what they call a behavioral covenant, meaning when we get together, when we talk, this is how we communicate, this is how we don't communicate. And it's there to establish the do no harm and making sure that everybody's committed to that part. So that way we can find that commonality. Bishop Job early in the chapter talks about when we're focused on not doing harm, we start looking at common goals. But the whole concept of the examination of how we live and practice our faith, that's a pretty great thing, but that's like me saying the easiest way to get to Phoenix is to fly there. Well, how are you going to fly? You don't have wings. How do you examine your life? How do you examine how you live your life? Dave, are you allowed to give yourself a physical?
A doctor that hasn't worked, if you're a physician to yourself, you have a fool for a patient. No, you should not give yourself a physical.
Yeah. Examinations are impossible to do, just be self-reflective. Wesley, that's why Wesley always had his accountability groups. That's how you look at your faith. When you pray together, when you profess your faith together, when you profess your goals together, that's an outward pouring of your soul, and other people will see that. And it's good, and you need to have that comfort level with a group and that commitment as a group, an intention as a group to be able to look at that. Who helps you see yourself through another set of eyes? Who helps you see yourself as the world sees you?
I have a wife.
Yeah.
The one that kind of honesty is really good.
Yeah.
I appreciate her for that.
Friends,
Friends.
But it's not every friend.
No.
Because it does require that level of honesty and trust.
Is
right.
that where, do I look good in this dress? Does that count? That kind of honesty?
First, do no harm.
That's good.
Yeah.
Good one, Dave.
It's okay, I'll tell her, Joel.
Those kind of friends.
I don't think we should sell short the whole concept of professional help. I think that therapists, and this is, I mean, my generation, I think hopefully is the last generation that has such stigma about that, but true self-reflection, you need professional help on that. I mean, pastors too, but go to a real professional, not us. Be on guard so that all actions and even my silence, I love that part, even my silence not add injury to another of God's children or to any part of God's creation. What do we think that Bishop Job meant when he wrote, or to any part of God's creation?
It could have meant other people.
Yeah.
Or the natural world.
Yeah. Natural world. And that gets to the environment, that gets to all things that are created.
And animals.
Yeah.
Right.
The Hebrew Bible has a lot of rules about how we kill animals and how we raise animals. And it's all about minimize, like, we need to eat meat. We Americans eat way too much meat, but we, like, biologically was a necessity for most of our development. But just because the end has to be violent doesn't mean that it has to be cruel. And I always really appreciated those passages in the Hebrew Bible that talks about, hey, these are God's creation too. These are God's creatures. Be nice to them. Who or what is injured by our silence, as individuals or as the church?
Lots of people, if we see harm being done to them, and we don't speak up. As simple as if you hear some gossip about somebody and you don't say anything. I mean, it can be that basic to much bigger things.
Yeah. Gets to all sorts of things like racism, sexism, and everything. But for the most part, we're silent about it.
My mind goes to, like, on a more interpersonal level, grief. That it's so hard to know how to interact with someone who's grieving. And so often we as churchgoers, we either pretend like everything's okay because we are either uncomfortable or we don't want them to be uncomfortable, or we give very basic platitudes. And silence as not speaking to their pain, silence as not grieving with them, I think is a very hurtful thing that we can do.
Really good point.
I make the joke that's not really a joke, that the United Methodist Church as an organization always speaks truth to power 50 years after the fact. We had in 2008, we had this big, at our general conference, I can't remember, it was like an order of reconciliation where we asked for forgiveness from the African American community for not being more active in their time during the civil rights movement and desegregation. Like 50 years after that whole movement was mostly over, we're like, oh, we should apologize for not doing that.
It's better than not apologizing.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's that. But we also have one of our resolutions was decrying our, I think like 1920, we made a social principle statement saying that eugenics is a great idea. Yeah. 50 years later, we had this whole like, yeah, we didn't really mean that. Sorry about that. We whoopsie daisy. But there's always that flip side of we should be on the leading edge of moral leadership. The church should always be pushing the boundaries of society. Society is always going to be not God's kingdom, so we need to be pushing them towards God's kingdom. And when you're that moral cutting edge, there's always going to be tons and tons of pushback, or at least there should be if you're trying to move forward in that Wesleyan growth transformation model. So you will always get that pushback. Is it fair to say that for like right now, there are racial issues, and the people who push back against those racial issues saying the church shouldn't be taking part of this because I don't want my church making me feel like I'm a racist? Is the church harming them?
Well, first of all, I'd argue with the idea that we should be pushing. We should be leading, not pushing.
Yeah.
And then leading in a loving way, and leading in a way that doesn't blame people for their past, tries to forgive them for their past, and also tries to understand how difficult it is for them to change, but expect the change and do it out of humility and not dictate. We're not going to get anywhere by pushing people. That's the last 4 year, now, 16 to 20 taught us that.
Yeah. At the same time, though, growth requires some stress there. I would say that, all of the books of the prophets would totally disagree with what you said, Dave. I don't. The prophets prophets have special permission to be like that. We don't.
The prophets from the Old Testament, you are correct. New.
Last week was Jesus cleansing the temple. Jesus had the fire prophet in him too. We can't forget that part. But we're not Jesus either, so we don't get special permission.
Right. And yeah. Anyway, it's first do no harm. Right? Yeah. So first be compassionate. Lead. Don't prod.
Yeah, it's especially on issues of racism. Racists will hurt others.
Well, that's unacceptable.
Yeah, holding them accountable. And again, most racism is unintentional and unaware. Like 99% of all racism is not people who belong to the Klan. However, if you hold someone accountable for a racist comment or racist belief, they will be offended and they will be hurt. Mm-hmm. Is that causing harm, or would my silence be causing harm?
In the longer term, your silence would cause more harm.
Yeah. you'll harm, like, there is a perfect way of doing that, and I don't know what that is. And I think that we'll get into that in the third general rule, but it's just kind of, when we look at real harm in the world, because it's easy to look at our relationships, and there's real harm in our relationships. When we look at these bigger issues, these contentious issues, silence is harmful, action is harmful. So when Wesley says, do no harm, a lot harder than we think it is, isn't it? So the last one, he says, by doing this, we'll be formed and transformed to live more like Jesus. In what ways will doing no harm make us live more like Jesus? Am I going to be a homeless man wandering around the countryside, gathering disciples?
I think part of it is the do no harm. Like we're thinking of it as like, okay, I always need to do the right thing. But even with your illustration of the Garden of Eden, and Eve made a bad choice, I would argue that that's framing it wrong. It wasn't a bad choice, it was a choice. She didn't know the consequences, and that's the point, is a lot of times we don't know the consequences of the choice we're going to make. We don't have foresight. And so the doing no harm motto, ideology, whatever we want to call it, is about being very intentional. And Jesus was always very intentional. And so that's a way that connects for me, is being more intentional, and not a lot of harm we cause is unintentional. The throwaway things we do or say and we don't think about it. We're not always going to do no harm because we don't know future consequences from our decisions, but being more intentional allows us to maybe do less harm.
Right, thinking before you speak, and not just reacting. Yeah, that's a good.
Or acknowledging that you don't agree, but not putting them down.
Mm-hmm.
Also confessing when you've caused harm. That just that simple admission of like, I made a mistake. It's hard for some people, but I've gotten really good at it. You make enough mistakes, I mean, you have tons of opportunity.
I'm with you there. I'm an expert on apologizing. Still not very good at it, but lots of practice.
Of course, that's not very Christ-like, is it? I don't think Jesus ever apologized, did he? Of course, since he never did any wrong or harm, I didn't have to.
Well, he apologized for all of us. He died on a cross.
Ooh, good call. Good call. Theologically stuffed that one. Nice job. Dunked on me.
It's like when they crank the net way down, and you can just pretty much put it in.
No, it's Wesley did have, I mean, he probably would have been diagnosed with anxiety. He was just always in his personal journals, which I should probably like go through all of my personal journals and mark which ones need to be burned when I die, because I don't want future generations to read all of them. Not that I would ever be the type of person that they would read, but man, like there's a lot of personal stuff published on Wesley from his personal journals, but he was racked with anxiety all the time about whether he was doing enough, whether he's achieved enough. Did he really fall back in this dark spirit? So that whole be on your guard, good advice, but at the same time, always remember that grace is part of the equation too. We are human, we will cause harm. Accept God's grace, accept that reality. They'll still be loved. We'll be okay. Next week, we are talking about doing good, which is a much more fun conversation. I will send out an email, a link to the United Methodist Social Principles, because again, these are the foundation of what we consider good as a church. And we probably like, I just want you to know that they're there and you can look at them, and there's a lot of like reasoning. The Book of Resolutions, which is far more substantial, goes into way more detail on all of those. We are a very officious church, very much so. But so yeah, next time we'll talk about doing good.